Hello and welcome to the last lecture on Chapter 10, where we're looking at muscle tissue, and in particular skeletal muscle tissue. And this will be the last lecture of this class. And today we're going to talk about muscle metabolism. So the question that we're going to try to address today in the lecture is, where does all the energy come from to produce the muscle contraction we've been spending the last few lectures describing and talking about? So let's go ahead and begin with that title, Muscle Metabolism. And the question, as I said, is where is this energy coming from? So ATP is needed in large quantities during a muscle contraction. So think about, just on a very small scale, just on a very localized scale, each cycle of the contraction cycle requires 2 molecules of ATP, and that's for a single head, a single myosin head, 2 molecules of ATP to go through the one cycle. And there are many, many cycles that are actually produced in order to shorten a muscle, to contract it fully. There are approximately 600 heads, although they're not all engaged at the same time. So about 300 heads or so of myosin that are in a single thick filament. So each of those is going through a cycle of using up 2 ATP. And there are hundreds of thousands of thick filaments within a muscle cell, within a myofibril, in fact, of a muscle cell, and many, many muscle fibrils within a muscle cell. So you can see that the energy budget is going to add up very, very quickly. And that's not even counting the energy required to maintain the calcium pumps that are removing calcium from the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and many of the other energy requiring reactions that have to take place in that cell. So tremendous amount of ATP is needed in order to maintain a normal muscle function. How do we get that ATP? That is the question that we're going to try to address here. So there are 3 systems that can produce ATP in a skeletal muscle cell. 3 systems. We're going to name them, and then we're going to describe each one of them. Number 1, creatine phosphate system. The creatine phosphate system. Number 2, the anaerobic respiration, or the anaerobic respiration system. And number 3, aerobic. System. So those are the 3 systems that we're going to be looking at, and each of those is supplying different amount of energy. Let's begin with the first one, the creatine phosphate system, and talk about that. So we'll start with this, the creatine phosphate system. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a molecule, creatine phosphate, which is going to store phosphate and can donate it back to ADP. So first, a little bit of background before we get started here. So there's always a certain amount of free ATP within a cell. In other words, the cells are generating ATP on a constant basis, and this includes all cells. And then that ATP is almost immediately used up to drive some system, some metabolism inside the cell to do some work. Now, in a given moment in time, if you were looking at that cell, you would see that there is a little slightly more AT available in that cell than what's required in that moment to do some work. So there's always a certain amount of free ATP. Not very much. In fact, what we're talking about is a very small amount of energy that can be available. Maybe about 3 seconds worth of energy is available in the body. So we're talking about 3 to maybe 6 seconds of energy is represented by this free ATP. Not very much. That doesn't get you very far, particularly in a muscle cell, where once you start using that muscle, you're going to start consuming huge amounts of ATP. So the amount of energy available in just in terms of free ATP is negligible and shouldn't really be considered at all. So if that's the case, then how can we take ATP, or how can we regenerate ATP once it's being used? So let's just stop for a moment and consider this reaction. So we can take ATP and we can convert it to ADP plus phosphate. And in the process, you're going to release energy. And that energy you can do work with. So the question then is there some way we can take and drive this reaction backwards in order to get back to the starting point of ATP? And that's what we have with the creatine phosphate system. So if we take a look at that system, first of all, let's take a look at the molecule of creatine phosphate. And this is what it looks like. And please don't try to write down this formula in your notes. You can just simply look at it at this point. So this is creatine phosphate, and as you can see, it has a phosphate group attached to it. We can take this phosphate group and donate it back to ADP. So one of the things that we can do is we can take creatine, and let's see if we have a reaction here, and we do. We have an image here. So we can take creatine, and here's that molecule again without the phosphate group. I can take ATP, take that phosphate, donate it to this molecule, and convert it into creatine phosphate. And they're calling this a different term, phosphocreatine ATP. It doesn't matter. Creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine doesn't really matter. The point is that we're storing the phosphate group on this molecule. Now, what that does is it doesn't actually give us ATP. In fact, we're actually using up ATP in that process. But what it does is it stores the phosphate group in a molecule or on a molecule, which can easily donate it back to ADP and convert ADP to ATP. So if we build up large amounts of creatine inside a cell, during times of rest, when we're not exercising, when there's not a large demand for ATP in the skeletal muscles, the ATP that's being created can be stored by donating that phosphate group to this molecule, creatine, having it converted into phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate. And when we start using up ATP and generating large amounts of ADP, we can use that stored phosphate group to donate it back to ADP and create another molecule, ATP, which then can be used to do work. Okay? So, creatine phosphate or creatine is converted into creatine phosphate during periods of rest. The phosphate group is stored on creatine phosphate. The phosphate group can then be donated back to ADP during times of work. Okay, so during rest, what happens is you're taking ATP plus creatine, and you're creating creatine phosphate. Plus ADP. Okay. During times of work, you're going to take creatine phosphate plus ADP and convert it to ATP plus creatine. So you might be asking yourself at this point, well, why not just have a lot of ATP around? Why do we have to go through this middleman here, or this middle step? And the answer is, if you have ATP, it's going to be used. That's its purpose, is to drive reactions. It's kind of like having money in the pocket. If you have money in the pocket, you're simply going to spend it. So you put it someplace where it's not so accessible by the cell. And so you're building up a savings account, which you can then draw down on in times of need. So we're building our savings account and create a savings of phosphate, which then can be used in times of need. If we simply just put it into ATP, that ATP molecule would be used somewhere in the cell to drive some chemical reaction. It doesn't last very long. Okay. So how much energy does this system provide for us? What are we talking about here? How much energy does this system provide for a muscle cell? So first of all, let us state this fact, that creatine is found only in muscle cells. Okay. In quantities about 6 times greater than ATP itself. Okay. So, if we take that and do some simple calculations, what you'll see is that we're going to have about 15 seconds, approximately, 2 squiggly lines, 15 seconds of energy is represented by this system. 15 seconds of energy, that can get you 100 meters. If you're running fast. So it's a system that's available in the immediate moment. As soon as you start working, this system is available to produce the energy requirements needed for a muscle to function. But after 15 seconds, the system is exhausted. It can no longer function to provide more energy because you've taken all of your savings account and spent it. So what can you do instead? What other sources of energy are available to keep ATP available? And you would turn then to the second system, which is anaerobic cellular respiration. Okay. This system is based on glucose. Okay. And the source of glucose in muscle cells is number one, glycogen, which is stored in skeletal muscle, as we've discovered. And number two, glucose from the blood. So coming in with the blood. Now the problem here, because this could be an unlimited source of glucose, depending on your internal body conditions. But the problem is that after your 15 seconds, your heart rate and your breathing is starting to climb a little bit, but the demand for ATP within a skeletal muscle is outstripping the ability of your circulatory system to deliver glucose and particularly oxygen into muscle cells. So between this ready source of energy and another source, the third source we're about to talk about, which is aerobic cellular respiration, you need a stopgap measurement. You need a stopgap plan. And that plan is this, anaerobic cellular respiration, producing energy without oxygen, because your respiratory system and your circulatory system has not caught up with demand for oxygen. We do have pre-stored sources of glucose, however, so we're going to utilize those to create some ATP. Okay? So how does this system work? Well, let's take a look at a typical pathway for using glucose to produce ATP, including the availability of oxygen in that picture. So in the next drawing, I'm going to go ahead and show you a very simplified drawing of the process of using glucose to generate some energy. So I'm going to draw a mitochondria here. So this is my mitochondria. And so what happens, and I'm simplifying this pathway to an extreme degree just so that we can understand the process. We don't need to understand the details. So I'm going to take glucose, which is, remember, 6 carbons. This is a molecule consisting of 6 carbons. And I'm going to split that glucose right in half. So I'm going to generate 2 molecules of something called pyruvic. Pyruvic. And this is going to be, so 2 pyruvic molecules. As I split that glucose molecules in half, I'm going to generate 2 molecules of ATP. Okay, so I get 2 molecules of ATP. But I can get more. So I can take these 2 pyruvic molecules, put them into the mitochondria along with oxygen, and out at the other end, I can get around 32 to 34 molecules of ATP. But I need this, the mitochondria, and I need this, the oxygen, to get that. So the most efficient system in producing ATP from a single molecule of glucose would be as if we had oxygen and mitochondria available to fully process that molecule to get the maximum amount of ATP out of it. But notice, I can still get some energy out of this system without mitochondria without oxygen? Well, as you know, skeletal muscles contain mitochondria, so that's not a problem. The problem is here. Do we have enough oxygen? And as I just mentioned, at this point in time, your circulatory system, your respiratory system has not caught up with demand. And so oxygen levels are quite low in skeletal muscles. And so we can't really depend on this system to generate the energy that we want. And so we're going to come back to this reaction and see if we can do something with this reaction that allows us to keep going around and around somehow and getting more molecules of ATP out of that. And so if we turn our attention then to this reaction, I'm going to take glucose, and I'm still going to convert it into pyruvic. And this is actually pyruvic acid. That's the full name. And I am going to get my 2 molecules of ATP out of there. Okay. But there's something I didn't add in that first drawing, which is that in order for this reaction to go forward, I need another molecule which has this name to it, NAD+, and I need 2 of those. And what's going to happen is I'm going to convert this molecule, when I convert glucose into pyruvic acid, I'm going to convert that molecule into this molecule, 2NADH. Okay? So notice I have added a hydrogen ion to that molecule. So I'm going to strip electrons out of glucose and remove some hydrogen ions. And I need to put them someplace. And where I'm going to put them is this. So you can think of this as a bucket. Okay? And the bucket is empty now. But once I go through the reaction, I now have a full bucket. Okay? So if I have a full bucket, I can't go back and use it again to create more of the pyruvic acid from glucose. So, for example, if I only had 1 bucket, I could only do this reaction once. If I had 2 buckets, I could do it twice. If I had 3 buckets, I could do it 3 times. Right? And this is, by the way, 2 molecules of ATP. So is there a way that I can empty this bucket and reuse it in this reaction? And the answer is yes. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to take my 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. I'm going to take this bucket and I'm going to dump these hydrogens and these electrons back onto pyruvic acid, and I'm going to create 2 molecules of lactic acid. So now I have an empty bucket. And now I can come back here and generate that reaction again. So I've emptied the bucket by taking the contents of that bucket, dumping it back onto the pyruvic acid molecule to create lactic acid. Now I have the empty bucket. I can do this over and over again and get these molecules of ATP out of that reaction. And as long as I have glucose, I can keep going. I can generate the energy. The problem is this. Lactic acid is toxic. It's not good for you. This is the burn that you feel in muscle tissue when you start working out. So you can tolerate certain levels of lactic acid, but in the end, you cannot tolerate high levels. You can't keep going forever and ever because of the toxic nature of lactic acid. Okay? What you're going to do then is you're going to do this reaction until the third and final system comes into play. But you're paying a price. So it turns out that during normal times, that is to say, when you're relaxed, not exercising, the pyruvic acid, or the lactic acid, can be converted back into ultimately glucose in the liver and in the kidneys. Lactic acid can be used by the heart as energy, as an energy source. So the heart muscles, cardiac muscle tissue can actually use this as a energy source. So it can burn it up and create energy from it. The rest of the body has to deal with lactic acid, which is atoxic. And so as you start generating this lactic acid, it's going to enter into the bloodstream. It's going into the liver. The liver can convert it back into ultimately glucose again, and the kidneys can deal with it as well. But that requires some time. And while you're exercising, this mechanism is going to be overwhelmed. It cannot deal with the amount of lactic acid that's being generated when you're exercising. And so this, even though this is available to you, it is not a solution. The only solution is to stop generating lactic acid. Okay? But to do that, you need oxygen. You need to start fully metabolizing, breaking down glucose using oxygen and mitochondria to produce ATP. And that you'll have to wait until the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system catches up with demand. So now the question is, how much energy does the system deliver? How much can you get out of this system? So we got 15 seconds approximately in the first system. And in this system, we're going to get around 30 to 40 seconds of energy. And at that point, things are starting to go a little bit south for us because the levels of lactic acid are building up to the point where it is not healthy for us. But fortunately, what's going to happen is that you're going to now go to the aerobic system. So the last system is the aerobic system. And this allows you for prolonged periods of activity. And that's going to require oxygen. And again, I emphasize, in order to deliver that oxygen, heart rate has to increase, breathing rate has to increase, and that oxygen has to be delivered to your cells. So what we're talking about here are this ability to run marathons and long distances, okay? So it also turns out, though, that you can store oxygen in your body. So where is oxygen available? So it's not an entirely bleak situation. We can store certain amounts of oxygen in our body. And the body normally stores approximately 2 liters of O2 in the body. And that is about a half a liter in the lungs, about 1/4 of a liter dissolved in fluids of all kinds. Okay. About 1 liter in hemoglobin, and about 1/3 of a liter in myoglobin. So 2 liters doesn't get us a lot. It gets us something, but not a lot. Again, we're facing a problem because there's simply not enough oxygen to generate energy through this more efficient system. And we're going to be turning to that system that produces lactic acid in the meantime. So this is used up within approximately 1 minute. As I said, not a lot of time. Okay. So you can improve your ability to maximize oxygen. You can build up your ability to utilize oxygen more efficiently if you are involved in aerobic exercising. So let's take a little bit of a picture there and see what that's all about. So the aerobic system needs to be built up through training. Okay. The way we can measure your ability to utilize this system better is through a measurement called maximal oxygen uptake. So let's talk about maximal oxygen uptake. And what this is about is that if in measuring humans' ability to become more efficient at utilizing and building up the aerobic system, we had to have some standard of comparison. We had to have a ability to measure that somehow. And what people came up with is this idea of maximal oxygen uptake. And what this represents is the maximal rate of oxygen consumption that is possible during aerobic breakdown of pyruvic acid into carbon dioxide. The maximum rate of oxygen consumption that is possible during aerobic breakdown of pyruvic acid into carbon dioxide. The maximum rate of oxygen use that is possible in an individual when you're taking pyruvic acid, dumping it into the mitochondria, and creating molecules of ATP. The end result is you're going to produce carbon dioxide as a waste product. Okay? So that's where carbon dioxide comes in, because as you break down pyruvic acid, the end result is carbon dioxide. So those carbons that make up pyruvic acid, and pyruvic acid is the 3-carbon-based molecule, they become carbon dioxide when you utilize oxygen. Okay. This ability, maximal oxygen uptake, is influenced by, number 1, gender. Turns out that this can be higher on average in males. So, on average, males tend to have a higher maximal oxygen uptake than females, on average. Number 2, age. Okay. So, you are improving up until a certain age, and then after that, this number starts to fall off. So normally, if this were a face-to-face class, I would ask the class at this point to guess what that number is. So go ahead as you're listening to this in your mind. Maybe write it down someplace. Guess what that number is. So what I'm asking you is to guess the age at which this measurement, maximal oxygen uptake, begins to decline as a result of age. Okay? So here's the sad news. It's best at 20 years. So for most of you, join the club. Okay? I've been there a long time. I'm a founding member, in fact. Number 3, size. Okay? So increase in body size is related to a higher maximal oxygen uptake. You have more mass, more consumption of oxygen. Okay, so maximum oxygen uptake is a way of measuring your system's ability to use oxygen to generate energy. When you train, when you run, that improves. Okay. If you're a couch potato, not so much. Okay. All right, let's look at this from another angle. What does this system, aerobic, what does the aerobic system need besides oxygen? Okay. So the aerobic system also requires some other things. All right. It requires a nutrient, something to burn, because oxygen is not there to generate the ATP. It's used in that process, but what we need is glucose. Okay. So, glucose can be stored, or a nutrients can be stored in the body as well. And where, you may ask, is that possible? So it can be stored in, number 1, skeletal muscle cells. It can also be stored in the liver. Those are the 2 major areas where they can be stored. So the liver can store about 500 grams, and there's about 75 grams stored in skeletal muscle. Now, that's maximal on average, the amount that you can store. So some people can be doing better than that, some are less so. But you have to actually put it there. And that's with all this carbohydrating stuff you are loading that you hear about for people who are running marathons and all the work that they're doing before a marathon, is they're trying to maximize the storage of glycogen in the body, because that's a real ready source of energy of glucose in the body. Obviously, you can also turn to other types of molecules, such as fats and even proteins, but they are less efficient. More time is involved in burning those. This amount is depleted in approximately 4 hours. So it's not the ultimate source. It's limiting to the fact of how much is actually stored in the body. As I said, you can also turn to fatty acids. That would be after you depleted this source, and this can become 50% of the energy needs. within around 3 to 4 hours. The next would be amino acids. And you don't ever really, in a healthy situation, want to get to the point where you're consuming amino acids, because that means you're breaking down your body proteins in order to feed the system. So your optimal situation is using up this. So oxygen is not really a limiting resources. It is in the beginning, when your heart rate and your breathing rate are still low. But once that comes online, once your heart rate and your breathing rate gets up to the point where it can supply the oxygen that the cells are demanding, the oxygen no longer becomes the limiting resource. What becomes the limiting resource for generating ATP at this point is the source of nutrients. Okay? And as we've outlined here, you have a ready source, a very quick source, and glycogen stored in skeletal muscle cells, around 75 grams, another about 500 grams in the liver. But even after 4 hours of continuous work, that is generally depleted. And then you start turning to your fatty acids as a secondary energy source. And so if you are graphing the use of energy over time, what you would see in your system is this would represent the demand for glucose in the body. You would reach a maximum and then you start exhausting it. And this would represent the demand for, let's see, good, here we go. And this would be for the fatty acids. And then this would be for amino acids. So this would be time. This would be glucose. This would be fats. And this would be proteins. Okay. Now, you never want to get to this point because you're actually cannibalizing yourself in order to generate the energy. And you're in starvation mode here, basically. Okay. But notice that there's an overlap between the use of glucose and fats. So it's not like you use up all the glucose and then fats begin. Now, you're already starting to utilize the fats even as you're still burning glucose, but you're reaching a peak and then fats can take over. Okay? So limiting resource in the aerobic system is not oxygen. It is the nutrients. As long as you have the nutrients, this can deliver energy for as long as those nutrients are available. So the first two systems are limited because of the amount of energy stored in those systems. 15 seconds, 30 to 40 seconds, then they're completely exhausted and done. Then this system can go on for a very long time as long as you keep pumping in the nutrients into that system to maintain the production of ATP. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have to say about metabolism, skeletal muscle metabolism. This is the last lecture. I would just like to summarize what we've been talking about here by trying to get you to think about this scenario and to, I'm sorry. I did want to do this. This is rather important. Let's summarize the systems. So the first system we talked about was the creatine phosphate system. And so you can see we can generate creatine phosphate by using ATP. So we're going to take ATP, donate the phosphate to creatine to create the creatine phosphate. Okay. This would be in times of rest when we're not demanding a lot from our skeletal muscles. Then we've stored that phosphate in the creatine phosphate, and we can donate it back to ADP to create ATP to keep the system going for a short period of time, as I said, around 15 seconds. Okay. So that's good for a short burst of energy. It's there, it's immediate, it's all contained within the skeletal muscles. Okay. The second system is the anaerobic respiration. And here we're taking glycogen, breaking it down into glucose. We have two sources, as I said, glycogen and from the blood. We need glucose. We're going to go through a process called glycolysis. We're generating 2 molecules of ATP. We're going to produce that 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. We can continue to do this as long as we empty those buckets. But in order to do that, we have to get lactic acid. This goes into the blood, is later dealt with by the liver and the kidneys. But this system has the drawback of actually producing lactic acid, which is a toxic material. And our body simply can't stand high concentrations of that, particularly the general body cells. Heart muscles, skeletal muscle cells, the liver, and the kidneys have evolved to tolerate higher levels of this poison than the rest of the body. And so they can deal with it a little bit better. Obviously, skeletal muscles, because we're generating it there. Liver can actually convert it back into something that is not toxic. The heart can burn it for energy, and the kidneys can also deal with it and convert it back into something less toxic. The best source, of course, is to generate ATP through cellular respiration. This is the aerobic system, and we can use any number of different food sources, but we need oxygen. So in the beginning, this is the limiting resources, the oxygen. And once though our body has started to deliver the amount of oxygen needed, then that no longer is the problem. The problem becomes what we're burning. And initially, we're going to be using up all of the glucose that's available, stored in the liver and in muscle cells. As that's depleted, we can start using fatty acids from adipose cells. And then once that becomes depleted, we can turn to amino acids. But this, you never want to be in that position, because that means you're in starvation mode and you're breaking down your own body to stay alive. But you are generating large amounts of ATP in that system. So that's aerobic cellular respiration. All right. So getting back to what I was saying earlier. So I want you to consider the following scenario. You have your keys sitting on the desktop next to you. You accidentally brush those keys off and they start to fall. You see that they're falling, and you catch them in midair. You grab them in midair as they're falling from the desktop. We've all experienced something like this, where something is falling, we're able to catch it before it actually hits the ground. Think about what your body is doing in order to accomplish that task. Starting from the very beginning, your body, your brain, had to recognize that those were keys, they're falling, you don't want them to fall. I don't know what's happening to me. And then your brain has to come up with a solution. It has to decide what muscles it's going to use in order to prevent that from happening. It has to decide where to place your hand in order to catch those keys. So it has to calculate how fast those keys are going and where your hand has to be to catch them before they hit the ground. So it's anticipating where those keys are going to be once your hand arrives at the scene. And it has to decide what muscles are involved in that process and how much of those muscles are needed in order to accomplish that task. And as you know, just simply in using the muscles, you have to generate a action potential in a neuron. That action potential has to travel down the axon to the synaptic end bulb. You have to release acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. Sodium ions have to come into the muscle cell. The muscle cell has to generate an action potential. Calcium needs to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The binding site on actin for the myosin heads has to be uncovered. You have to form the cross bridges. And then you have to slide the thin filaments across the thick filaments in order to get the muscle to contract. All of that is happening in a split second. And if you think about the number of steps involved in terms of your body thinking about what it wants to do, anticipating the action, determining what muscles are involved, where they need to be, how much of those muscles need to be engaged, that's an amazing accomplishment in a split second. So if you think about that for a while, I hope it gives you some sense of the amazing ability of your body. The physiology, the biology of your body is simply mind-boggling when you start to think about all of these processes that we've been learning about. And the good news is that as you go forward in these series of classes in 40B and 40C, it will become even more mind-boggling. The physiology and the biology that you're going to learn about yourself is truly amazing. So I hope you keep that in mind as you're going through the course and not simply think about this as grades, but really you're learning about a really fascinating biological system, which is your own body. So thank you. I will see you, I'm sure, at some point. Good luck to everybody, and have a great life.